Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. So my name is Johanna Siljakus. I work for the Transport Sector Office at the Asian Development Bank, and I support the e-mobility support and investment platform. And I'd like to warmly welcome all of you to today's webinar on Battery Passport Pilot Scheme by Inga Petersen. So as many of you will know, the webinar is organized under the umbrella of the e-mobility support and investment platform for Asia and the Pacific. This is a platform that aims to build capacity and support the scaling up of financing of e-mobility initiatives. It's operated by ADB, it's co-implemented by UNEP and co-financed by the GEF, the Global Environment Facility. And we have today a very exciting theme. Just as background, so last week we held a very interesting panel discussion on the early stages of the battery life cycle, including battery manufacturing and mineral sourcing. The battery passport was brought up during this discussion a couple of times, actually. So this presentation is very timely. And just for your information, so we will actually continue with these panel discussions also moving forward in the year. So we'll have a panel discussion on battery end of life lined up, so on recycling and reuse. But just very briefly, before we move into this today's webinar, so if you would like to join the e-mobility community under the platform and stay up to date on the platform's activities, you can fill in this community survey, which is on your, or you can see a QR code on the screen now to it, and you can leave us your contact details through that survey, in case you have not done so already. I know many of you have actually. We'll also post the link to the survey in the chat in a bit. And in this webinar series, just a little bit of what's coming up next. So we have two exciting webinars lined up for the end of Q1. We'll continue with webinars in Q2, but our next webinar will be by Cohen van Bakel on EV charging networks or interurban EV charging networks in Bangladesh. So please do join that one as well. We'll send the registration link in the chat as well. So now I'll hand over to Tom Fleming from our implementing partner, Integrated Transport Planning. He will be moderating today's session. So over to you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody, and thank you. Thank you very much for joining today. Just to begin with a few house rules. So just to let you know that microphones will be muted during the course of today's presentation. But you are free to any questions you have for Inga, please post them in the Q&A function during the course of the presentation, and we'll pick them up and pose them at the end as part of the question and answer session. Yeah, if there's any sort of clarification needed around questions, then we can unmute microphones at that stage, but they will be muted for now. Next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So today I'm delighted to welcome Inga Petersen. Inga is the Executive Director of the Global Battery Alliance, which is a partnership focused on the production of sustainable batteries. Inga has over 15 years experience in natural resource management, governance and transparency, and she has held various roles at the UN Environment Programme, World Economic Forum and Adam Smith International as well. So in today's webinar, Inga will be introducing us to GBA's Battery Passport Pilot Programme. I don't want to give too much away, so without further ado, I will hand over to Inga. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom and Johanna, for inviting the Global Battery Alliance to contribute to this series. I'm so happy to see this level of interest for batteries, which of course play an essential part for the energy transition. So I'm going to try sharing some slides with you to help take us through this conversation. I assume that you can see my screen, otherwise please somebody speak up. but I'm just going to assume it. So the Global Battery Alliance was founded as an initiative of the World Economic Forum in 2017 originally, really with the twin realization that batteries are going to play an essential role for the energy transition. We're now looking at, the COP commitments, for example, of tripling renewables by 2030. So there's a huge role for energy storage to actually underpin that shift and support the shift to renewables, for example, but of course also in the electrification of the power and transport sector. But at the same time, there are impacts and risks along the battery value chain. And at the time in 2017, it was particularly the attention given to issues of child labor in cobalt, artisanal mining value chains in the DRC. So the partners of the Global Battery Alliance came together to say these issues are so complex to resolve that they really require cross-value chain collaboration and multi-stakeholder partnership, because it is essential that we do scale battery value chains, but that we do it in a way that is sustainable, circular, and just, so that we meet the targets of the Paris Agreement, but also respect the objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals at the same time. So you see here these three components of our vision: establishing a circular battery value chain, establishing a low carbon economy in the value chain, but doing all of this while safeguarding human rights. And the way that we seek to do that is through multiple axes. The first one most directly informs the concept of the battery passport. So really establishing trusted criteria, data, and benchmarks for a sustainable and transparent battery value chain, because we cannot manage what we can't measure. And we cannot improve what we can't measure. And then, of course, as a second step, mobilizing collective action across the value chain to improve the environmental, social, and governance footprint of the value chain, but also advocate for the essential role of batteries in the green transition. We've captured this vision for a sustainable battery value chain by 2030 in our original vision report, which we published in 2019. It's worth pointing out that in 2019, we had predicted a tenfold growth of the battery industry by 2030. If you look at the trajectories now, at the time we were almost criticized for being too optimistic for the outlook for batteries. But I think now the rest of the world has caught up, and we're actually looking at a 17-fold increase of the sector by 2030. So almost 30% year-on-year growth if we're looking at energy storage solutions, for example. This is not working. Voila, this was just slow to come, I'm sorry. So yes, we're looking, so this makes the mission of the Global Battery Alliance even more urgent. It's also worth pointing out the economic and social opportunities associated with that growth if it's managed responsibly. So at the time, we had looked at the potential for about 10 million additional jobs across the value chain, from mining, manufacturing, to the recycling industry. But we're now actually looking at up to 18 million jobs to be created as a result of the scale-up of the battery industry. The other thing is around life cycle emissions. So I believe you already had a couple of webinars in this series talking about batteries. And of course, it is well known that the battery is the most emissions intensive component of the electric vehicle, specifically the battery production process. At the time in 2019, we had predicted up to 50% emissions reduction potential across the production phase. But we're now more optimistic that emissions can actually be cut by up to 90% if the right measures are implemented across the value chain. So really making battery electric vehicles the obvious choice for future transportation. Our founding members in the beginning numbered 19. So the key thing is that we bring together the end-to-end value chain, some of the world's biggest mining companies, the cell manufacturers themselves, the OEMs, but all the way to the recyclers. But then critically, we bring those together, including in our governance, which is split between corporate and non-corporate members, with NGOs who ultimately are asking for this increased accountability and collective responsibility for the impacts across the value chain, public sector organizations, associations, And then you see in the middle the technology partners who will ultimately be implementing solutions such as the battery passport commercially, whereas the GBA brings these partners together in a pre-competitive context. All these partners have endorsed our 10 guiding principles for a sustainable battery value chain. So you see on the left-hand side, the 3 objectives that I had outlined before, and then how we seek to implement them on the right-hand side. So if I just highlight 2, I already spoke about the potential to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. We've been working on this specifically, and I'll tell you more about this in a minute. But also principle 8 on immediately and urgently eliminating child and forced labor, strengthening communities and respecting the human rights of those employed by the value chain. We have multiple action partnerships. The flagship is the battery passport, and we'll get to that in a second because I know this is what you're most interested in today. But I do need to do justice to the other work that the GBA has also been engaged with. We have hosted in the past the Cobalt Action Partnership to facilitate a consensus on what responsibly sourced artisanal cobalt from the DRC would look like, which has now evolved into the Critical Minerals Advisory Group, looking more at how do we solicit insights across the value chain to identify the bottlenecks to making battery value chains more sustainable at the global level. So outside of the confines of any geostrategic competition, in a politically neutral format, what are the key bottlenecks to more sustainable battery value chains so that we can engage with policymakers on that. And in the past, we've also published quite a few insight pieces on energy access and circularity, looking at the role of batteries in mini grids, for example, in Africa. So to get to the theme of today, what is the battery passport? I think some of you might already have some familiarity if it came up in previous webinars. Essentially, the Global Battery Alliance conceptualized this idea of a battery passport back in our original vision report as a digital product passport for batteries that has a really strong focus on the sustainability performance across the value chain. So the way we've conceived of the battery passport is really 3 core components. One being the traceability of the material, so the tracking and tracing of the material flows. Where was the nickel mined, refined, and then manufactured and ultimately placed on the market, the cobalt, the lithium, etc. And this traceability is already in place for many other materials, but also other product groups. But then critically, how do we combine that with really consistent reporting against key sustainability performance indicators across the value chain so that we ultimately achieve comparability as to the sustainability performance, and which will then enable us to benchmark products and to issue a score for the product so that we really create a platform on which products and companies can compete based on sustainability performance and have their efforts recognized and validated through this ESG score, so that it really provides additional incentives for better social environmental performance. And then, of course, the final component of the battery passport is the technical data of the battery. So many of you will already be familiar with the EU battery regulation, which I think became an active piece of regulation about 10 days ago, and which will mandate the introduction of a battery passport in the EU for any batteries above 2 gigawatt per hour, so including battery energy storage solutions as of 2026, 2027. And this type of technical data that is required includes, on the one hand, some sustainability metrics, such as the battery carbon footprint, but also recycled content of the battery and other parameters like the technical data, like manufacturing history, charging rates, temperature range, etc. In order to show that this can actually work in practice, we've leveraged the benefit of having the entire value chain united in our membership, and we worked with 2 major OEMs and their respective value chain across 3 different products, 3 different battery products, to establish a proof of concept of the battery passport. So for a partial material coverage, cobalt and lithium of those battery products, we worked with a number of different track and trace solution providers to establish the traceability, but then also to have each contributor of that value chain, from the mining companies through to the OEM, so from cradle to gate, report against battery carbon footprint. So what are their respective contributions to the battery carbon footprint, as well as human rights and child labor due diligence according to rule books that were developed in a multi-stakeholder process, in multi-stakeholder working groups at the GBA. And we managed with an indicative scoring exercise to establish 3 different differentiated scores for those efforts according to the reporting to show indeed that this can be done. Of course, in this first instance, and it's important to highlight that, the data was self-reported. In the future, independent validation and verification of this data is obviously essential and will be a prerequisite to any type of score. So at the proof of concept stage, the GBA did not issue a score or a quality seal, but really just worked to differentiate the performance. We're currently in the second phase of the battery passport, where we're building out the parameters to what does good sustainability performance actually entail when it comes to battery value chains. So we had started with battery carbon footprint, human rights, and child labor, but we're now working on the next set of indicators that are salient risks, or that represent salient risks for the battery passport or for the battery value chain. Of course, there's also a key challenge in terms of combining what are the regulatory requirements, which are now specific in the EU, but we also find other relevant regulatory requirements. If we're looking, for example, at the US and any forced labor due diligence, for example, that needs to be captured within this framework, but that also needs to be combined with existing voluntary standards that are already in application. So if a mining company is, for example, certified by IRMA, by the Initiative for Responsible Mineral Assurance, how can they distinguish that they're going beyond compliance, that they're doing more in terms of addressing some of the root causes of these issues? So we've carried out this regulatory mapping across I think 19 key jurisdictions that are really essential to battery value chains as of today. And then seeing how do we combine this in a coherent manner with the application of voluntary standards across the value chain. If you'd like to look into it a little bit in further detail, on the first set of indicators, these rulebooks are available publicly. The most mature deliverable is the greenhouse gas rulebook, where we really were the first to publish a framework of consistent rules on how to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions for each economic operator, the relevant contributions, in a manner that is comparable and that is product specific, so that we have this granularity of information to allow for the comparability and to allow for companies and products to compete based on their ability to produce lower carbon emitting batteries. We have already hosted a public consultation. Actually, if you're interested, tomorrow there's a webinar being hosted together with the Nickel Institute and the Cobalt Institute, specifically on the greenhouse gas rulebook, the battery carbon footprint. And I believe it's specifically tailored towards stakeholders in Indonesia. I'm happy to share the link afterwards. I think it's still possible to register, where we'll be going into depth on this greenhouse gas rulebook and how it might be relevant, especially to the upstream and producing countries. But you'll also find on our website the child labor and human rights indices, which give you a sense of the types of expectations that would be placed on companies, but in a way that we're really trying to facilitate continuous improvement. So we're trying to reconcile the ability to implement and creating a low barrier to participation for companies to actually start reporting and disclosing, but at the same time, trying to set a high level of ambition so that you can showcase this progressive improvement over time and have that recognized. So if you look at the child labor and the human rights indices today, I think no company would be expected to necessarily have the answers to all the questions, but this is the sort of level of expectations that has been also filtered into our working groups from civil society organizations and others. And if you'd like to learn more about our experiences from the piloting exercise, we've captured that in this report that you see on the top left-hand side, the proof of concept pilots, setup, learning, and next steps. which I also recommend if you're more interested in the granular learnings that we had through this piloting exercise and the many questions that it raised, including questions related to the protection of commercially sensitive information. How do you balance this with advocating for progressive transparency and increasing transparency across the value chain? I mentioned to you that we're currently on the next set of performance expectations. So we are continuing to host our multi-stakeholder working groups, which are open to all of our members, and are working on guidelines for forced labor due diligence, indigenous people's rights, circular design of batteries, and biodiversity. So if you are interested in learning more about this, I'd be very happy to talk to you about this further. Yeah, maybe a word on how we actually come up with these performance expectations. I mentioned that we're hosting these multi-stakeholder working groups that have representatives from the companies that actually have to implement and that are already working according to different voluntary standards or legal requirements. But then really facilitating that negotiation of what is the expectation from civil society groups, from government stakeholders themselves, from affected communities, and balancing that with what are companies able to do and which level of aspiration can we collectively commit to. I spoke to you about the quality seal. So if you imagine this battery passport, and if you imagine the regulatory requirements versus the framework that the Global Battery Alliance is working on, you would see the labeling, the technical and the usage data, for example, all these requirements really specified in the regulation. So this is not something that the Global Battery Alliance is specifically working on in the context of the EU or other jurisdictions, because this is really determined by the regulators themselves. But when it comes to defining this key sustainability performance indicators and benchmarking that in order to issue that quality seal or that ESG score, this is really our core focus, and that is a complement that we are looking at developing really with a global outlook and not specific to regulations or regulatory requirements in the EU alone, even though for now it's the only jurisdictions with a specific battery passport requirement. In its full expression, ecosystem looks something like this, and I'll let you digest this for a second. I think this is a helpful demonstration where at the bottom of the slide you see the value chain, and in the different colors of the bubbles you see which data would be recorded or requested at which point. So if you're looking at the green ticks, the sustainability performance expectations, actually you start collecting this data prior to the existence of the battery. And this is exactly what some of the commercial solution providers enable, where the Global Battery Alliance is not going to be publishing or issuing any type of battery passport application, but we're focusing on the rules of reporting and what actually needs to be reported on in terms of this consistent performance, really through all the stages of the battery production process, from mining to recycling. And then when you go into the life cycle, this is again where regulations really specify the sort of data collection requirements on the battery state of health, for example, which is going to be a key indicator when it comes to actionable information for recyclers, for example. Should there be a second use? Should the battery be repurposed? Or is it at the end of life and should be recycled, for example? So this is really, the battery passport is really a key facilitating tool for enhancing circularity across the life cycle. So the data would be independently verified, possibly by accredited auditors or others. And then the GBA would really look at benchmarking the reporting, just aggregated data sets. So the GBA is not looking at collecting all of the data from all the battery passports, but really on aggregated, sanitized data sets, being able to benchmark and issue this ESG score, and still, continuing to refine and review these performance expectations. I think I'm going to stop here. It's a lot to take in, but I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. I see there's comments in the chat, and I haven't been able to look at them, so I'm going to stop the share And I can pull the slides up again if you have specific questions on a specific slide, or just speak like that. But I'm gonna pause here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Inga. Really interesting to learn about the work of the battery passport pilot, and excited to think where it will lead, and of course its role in ensuring sustainable and circular battery value chain. I'm sure it will become the norm as we progress towards 2030, with some really large increases in sort of opportunity by that time. I just noted down some sort of contextual points from your presentations for a 17-fold increase in the sector by 2030, and equating to a 30% year-on-year increase, 18 million new jobs, which is roughly the size of Cambodia or Kazakhstan, for example, in population. So yeah, huge opportunity, and then clearly failing to get this right will have consequences. So we need to get it right now. Thank you again. I think if we have any questions for Inga, please do drop them in the Q&A that have been starting to come through. So just to kick things off, so of course all of us here are very much advocates for sustainable and circular batteries, and of course it's one of the key motivations, I guess, behind the mobility platform. Could you talk candidly about your sort of real world experience of achieving this in practice, and what the main challenges are to sustainable and circular batteries, either from the perspective of maybe in general, or tracking and tracing through the work of the GBA, and is a gold standard battery, for example, maybe a more expensive battery?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. There's definitely a number of challenges, really ranging from just the fluctuation in terms of costs. So if we're looking at, the commodities or the raw materials for batteries, you see price fluctuations, of up to 80%. Lithium prices have dropped by 80%. The same volatility you see on cobalt and nickel as well. So of course, the question of cost of implementation regularly comes up in terms of, yes, we do want higher standards for social and environmental performance, but it doesn't come for free. How should this cost be, allocated? And I think, in a way, the battery passport is a contributing factor to making it more achievable, because it actually spreads the accountability across the value chain. So whereas today, you might have OEMs placing a set of expectations on mining companies, through this transparency across the value chain, you actually, creating shared accountability at the product level. So there's already, I think, one part of the answer. I think the other response that I typically have on cost of implementation is that it is far outweighed by the cost of inaction. Because if we're looking at the sort of raw material requirements for this 17-fold increase, there were some estimates back in 2022, and I don't think they've changed tremendously, in order to actually produce the nickel, cobalt, lithium required to feed all these gigafactories and all these projects that have been announced and are in the process being constructed. We would need up to 300 new mines for these commodities around the world by 2030. And, if we're looking again at the fact that most of the most easily or most high quality deposits have been exhausted already or have been extracted, you are looking at increasing overlaps with higher biodiversity areas, with indigenous people's lands. So the sort of environmental and social impacts are inevitable, and they need to be carefully managed. And there's no silver bullet. There's this conversation around, if we go and do deep sea mining, we'll just have to collect the nodules. It's obviously not as easy as that. So we do have to tackle these challenges head on. And I also, if you look at the social license to operate, I think is going to become even more essential when it comes to, really sharing the costs and benefits of the green transition more equitably across the supply chain. So that's like a whole group of challenges, and I've already sort of responded to them in my answer. I'm sorry, but this is a typical question where I really think it's not a nice to have, or it's not optional to increase the performance. It's actually an essential criteria, because otherwise, if we're looking at Panama in January, one of the largest open pit copper mines went offline from one day to the next. It was shut down because of social protests. So these are, it's not, it's not a nice to have. It's really essential to have that social license to operate. Then the other questions are obviously much more technical in terms of sharing commercially sensitive data. So even if you're looking at battery chemistry, for a recycler to have access to the information on the underlying battery chemistry, the components, is an essential part to facilitating their process and making it much easier and more valuable. But at the same time, battery chemistry is highly commercially sensitive, because that's where products compete with each other. So these are the types of questions where the regulators really need to create the safe space to be able to share this data. And that's exactly the idea of the battery passport, that there would in fact be multiple interfaces. The end consumer that is interested in, does this battery actually comply, with due diligence or performance expectations, they don't need to have detailed information on the material flows from each participant in that value chain. But the regulator might want to have access to a different set of information. The recycler might need to have different access, etc. So this, there would be nationally competent authorities to have specific interfaces to address that question. I mean, these are just two issues. So from our perspective, we definitely feel it's achievable. Industry has shown a willingness to implement it, but at the same time, there's also economic realities that need to be taken into account. And that's why, we don't want to create a very high entry barrier to enabling this reporting, but really trying to mainstream companies into the general concept and then progressively raising the level of expectation.
Super. Thanks, Ingrid. I guess
that was a very long answer. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I guess the number of stakeholders you had on your slide there sort of highlights the need and the importance as well. So we've got a couple of more questions coming in. So Andy asks, for national level tracking, have you considered developing a toolkit that could be adopted by individual nations for tracking the battery data?
So I'm not sure what exactly is meant with national level tracking, whether that is sort of the life cycle stages or, the batteries while they're in use. Because if you're looking, for example, at China, there's already data collection in place. The batteries already have QR codes when they're placed on the market, so that the material can be located and recovered, and a certain degree of battery state of health data collection as well. So I think that at the national level is really that part of the equation, or that part of the data that is of particular interest. But this, so this is not exactly, okay, thanks. Yeah, so I guess it's less the question of the sustainability criteria, but more in terms of battery state of health. And as I mentioned, in the EU, I think in the EU battery regulation, they're looking at establishing these national competent authorities that would have access to that type of information. But this is really an EU-specific requirement. So if we're looking at other jurisdictions around the world, I think there's different stages. I would say China is one of the countries that already has the elements of that in place. It's something that a little bit goes beyond the mandate of the GBA to be able to engage bilaterally with individual countries. But I think I would point you to the EU battery regulation to see what the vision is to implement this in the EU, and to what extent that is replicable in other jurisdictions as well.
Thanks, Inga. And we have another question from Kern. Kern asks, how does usage data collection work? Would the data be available through some public platform API, or be retained by OEMs or other parties?
So again, in terms of the standards on data access, this is not something where the GBA is currently working on specifically. For us, the actionable information is really related to the sustainability reporting, so that we can carry out the benchmarking and issue that ESG score. I think the second component of that question in terms of this data collection, so what you find right now is the development of many commercial battery passport solutions. So these are track and trace solution providers. Some of them are blockchain companies, but you also find big companies like Siemens or SAP or Microsoft who will be launching battery passport solutions that are more integrated maybe with the IT solutions already in operation in terms of data collection, data sharing. You also find many companies developing their own traceability solutions. I think in terms of data access, it's very much on a need-to-know basis. So I think in the EU battery regulation, again, even any single participant in that value chain would not have access to all the data from all the other participants, but maybe only to their direct suppliers or direct purchasers on a need-to-know basis. So this protection of commercially sensitive data is really essential to be able to make the system work. So I don't think there's any plan for sort of public accessibility, but it's within the remit of these national competent authorities to determine what is the type of data that they want to collect for regulatory purposes.
Super, thanks, Inga. So another question. So how do you see sort of battery technology evolving over the decade to come, and what impacts could potential changes have on the supply chain and the circularity of batteries?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question because if we're looking at circularity, key to the equation is to have a robust recycling industry that ultimately will progressively increase the share of secondary materials into the value chain and reduce, the pressure on primary raw materials. But you were sort of looking at a disconnect between the time horizon because it requires significant investments today, but you'll only have the relevant volumes and the feedstocks of all these batteries coming offline. If we're looking again, for example, at Europe or even the US, there's about a 10-year make for this first generation of EV batteries to come off stream in a meaningful way to present significant feedstock to make these businesses viable, recycling businesses. And what you don't know now is, what is going to be the value of nickel or cobalt in 10 years' time? Will the battery chemistries have evolved to a point that they're not actually valuable at all? And we're looking only at sodium batteries or LFP or whatever chemistries. So this is the key challenge where I think policymakers also need to step in and create some stability and incentives and probably support this industry to build up, to play this essential role. In terms of the chemistries, however, I think it's really a portfolio product. So it's unlikely that there will be one dominant battery chemistry in the future, but there'll be different battery chemistries for different applications, whether it's storage, whether it's, light vehicles, whether it's heavy duty, or whether it's even shipping or aviation in the future. So chances are that the requirements for energy density and other assets or weight, they really vary per application. So I think this is probably the way to look at it more as a sort of portfolio product.
Thank you, Inga, for that. We've got another question just come in. So Julian asked, how can officials of developing countries apply battery passport into their EV battery policy? Any practical level examples?
Yeah, I think this is really a key question. Thank you for that, Jiwon. So there's two parts to this. I think in terms of developing countries, if we're looking at mineral producing countries, a key component is to mainstream sustainability standards within their national jurisdictions. A lot of it right now is sort of on voluntary reporting, voluntary standards, but ultimately, the pressure to implement, comes from regulatory requirements and having to, respect local laws in developing the sector. On the downstream side, so if we're looking at EV battery policy, of course, an obvious thing could be to look at global harmonization of the battery passport concept beyond the EU. So it's completely within, the remit of other countries. And in fact, China has also kickstarted a process to look at, what would be the parameters of a Chinese battery passport. In the US, there's conversations around the traceability of the materials, so maybe less around the sustainability metrics for now, but in order to qualify for tax incentives under the IRA, you also need this proof of provenance for the materials. So I think this is another way to mainstream this in different countries, to start with these requirements and really to harmonize some of the requirements of the EU battery regulations at the global level, so that we can really create that level playing field and provide a platform for products to compete globally based on these sustainability metrics, based on their ability to produce low carbon batteries, etc. And we already see countries positioning themselves according to these metrics. So if you're looking at Canada, for example, or specifically Quebec, their main value proposition is that they're able to produce really low carbon batteries, and they've been able to attract a lot of investment because of this fact, because of the renewable energy infrastructure that is already available, and hydropower in particular.
Thanks, Inga. And just finally, a question from me. I see that other MDBs such as the World Bank and the African Development Bank, I think maybe EBRD are members of GBA already. What would ADB or any new member need to do as part of that process, and what would be required of them downstream?
So from our members, it's basically there's two components. of any corporate members for any of these value chain businesses. It's actually the same process. So we usually receive a sort of application form for membership. It requires an endorsement of the 10 guiding principles, so really to ensure that the vision is aligned with the Global Battery Alliance. And so for non-corporate members, for multilateral organizations, there's no membership fees. We have a review by our board of directors for any applicant or any interested party to join the effort. And then we onboard them into our working groups, whichever is most aligned with their key area of interest. Some multilateral organizations are more involved than others. So for example, the IFC sits on our board of directors. So they're really actively engaged in decision-making as to the organizational strategy of the Global Battery Alliance. So there's opportunities to really co-own this effort, which has to be a global effort and which has to be public-private, in our opinion.
Thank you, Inga. And I'm conscious of time. Okay, I can't see any further questions. So at this point, like I said, I'd like to thank you for your time and for coming and presenting to us today. It's been really insightful, and to all of our participants, of course, as well for joining. And we hope everyone found it useful and took something positive from the session. We will be sharing a recording of today's webinar with all participants registered, so that'll be circulated as soon as possible. And we hope that you'll join us for our next webinar, which will be on developing interurban EV charging networks in Bangladesh. It should be by Kern from Rebel Group. Kern was on today's session as well. And that'll be on the 13th of March at the usual time of 3 p.m. Manila time. So yeah, that's everything from me. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day, whatever time it is, with you. And thank you again for joining us. And goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye.